Good afternoon, colleagues, and thank you for being here today at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs for this public seminar, The State of Peace in Africa. My name is Dr. Andrew Chi. I'm a senior researcher here at the Institute, and I also work on the Training for Peace program, which also celebrates its 30th year this year. Since 1995, the program has worked through civil society institutions to strengthen civil and police capacity for the United Nations and the African Union. The program has expanded its work over the last 30 years, and this has expanded across various different thematic areas, but its central focus and pivot has always been on peace and security, with a particular focus on the African Union APSA division. The role of TFP, the program itself, is not just about the support to the African Union, though that is a central part, but it's also about the technical support that goes behind the programmatic work, the critical thinking that it provides towards the AU and REX, and the knowledge and lessons and informed policy for taking and tackling many of the multiple issues that the continent faces, not only today, but in the future as well. So I'm honored to have today with us three main or core partners for the Training for Peace program. The first is from Accord. We have Ms. Karishma Raju, who is the Senior Program Officer at the Center at Accord and is part of the Training for Peace program. Online, we have Dr. Linda Dakwa, who serves as the Training for Peace Coordinator and also a Senior Associate at the University of Ghana, and Dr. David Johannes, who's a Senior Researcher and Project Manager for the Training for Peace program at the ISS as well. So before we start, just to remind you to switch off your phones or put them on silent. I've got some list of things as well to go through. The event is going to be live streamed as well. For those of you who don't know, the exits are through the reception area as well. And there's also toilets before you get to reception on the left-hand side. And I think that's it. If there is a fire alarm, Nina at the reception will guide us, so just be mindful to leave your stuff and then we'll follow her guidance as well. So without further ado, I'll hand the floor over to Karishma, Linda, and then Dan.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to colleagues. Andrew, I'm hoping that there's not going to be any fire in terms of a literal fire, but I hope in terms of the discussion this afternoon from the presentations that we make to engage with you in terms of the work that we are doing as Accord, the ISS, and NUPI with the African Union through the Norwegian-funded Training for Peace program. That, like Andrew said, is 3 decades in the making in terms of commitment and support to continental peace and security, and recognizing the value not only that Norway brings to the continent, but the African Union itself to the continent and onto the global stage as well. In terms of the focus of my presentation this afternoon, I represent the African Center for the Constructive Resolution of Disputes, which brings to bear in terms of conflict management, conflict prevention, negotiation, mediation skills into the Training for Peace program in terms of the institution's core work. Particularly with regard to our work on the Training for Peace program, we have worked with the African Union through the civilian dimension and strengthening the civilian dimension of peace support operations. And for today, I will look at it from the perspective of the AU's prevention, mediation, and political dialogue efforts, and how we can look at conflict resolution tools to be enhanced in order for the African Union to remain effective amid new and complex threats. Now, that's a mouthful all on its own in terms of ensuring that there's sustainability of mechanisms, but also in a changing global environment that we find ourselves in. In terms of mediation, we recognize that it has been central to conflict resolution in terms of intra and interstate conflicts across the continent, and has been primarily facilitated at a track 1 level in terms of governments, either through the United Nations, the African Union, as well as the regional economic communities or mechanisms. We know that there's also an inclusion of Track 2 level processes, such as those that have been undertaken through specific initiatives by non-governmental organizations. But as the nature of conflict on the continent continues to evolve and become more complex, threats to security have tended to extend beyond boundaries of member states and beyond that of a single state requiring regional responses. The AU has certainly positioned itself as the continental anchor for peace and security as well as stability, making it the prerequisite on the continent for sustainable development as well as regional integration. But the reality is that the continent is not one without challenges. We know that armed conflicts and wars have increased. We can only turn on the news to be able to see what's at the forefront in terms of the continent and the world. And the complexity of such conflicts have certainly intensified, from Sahel to the Horn, Great Lakes, as well as parts of Southern Africa. From coups to terrorism to violent extremism, these have continued to expand, and this has increasingly created a governance challenge and brings into question the legitimacy of institutions, particularly like those of the African Union, and the question around the social contract between state, citizen, and the process then of exclusion. On the failure of the social contract aspects, when governments cannot deliver food, cannot deliver health services, are unable to provide water, shelter, energy, education, safety, these frustrations turn into localized conflicts, leading to social unrest and instability. And then we find the links with transnational organized crime having to emerge and evolve, and the links start to become closer and more connected. Add to this the several economic drivers that we find many of the African member states in, from unemployment, poverty, high levels of inequality, and an overdependence on the export of raw materials, as well as a dependence on foreign aid. Our abundant minerals on the continent tends to enrich external actors, leaving citizens that are often angered and frustrated, placing an emphasis on transactional arrangements rather than transformational ones. We see today some emerging and new threats: climate insecurity, cyber threats, droughts, floods. We live in an age of information, misinformation, disinformation, as well as artificial intelligence that can change not only our perceptions, but the way we perceive ourselves as well, or how we may view ourselves physically sometimes. All of this is severely impacting the humanitarian situation. We know, for example, in Sudan, there's double-digit million displacements taking place, famine conditions in multiple locales, as well as systemic attacks across civilians in the country. The reality is that all of these causes of conflict and the drivers are not in abstract. If anything, they are connected to undermine inclusive peace on this continent. And this is already challenged by fragile state infrastructure, which is contributing to a deteriorating security environment. If this were a movie, there'll just be too many plots to imagine, all happening at the same time to fully appreciate the role of best actor or best actor in a supporting role. In this scenario, the African Union or the regional economic communities and regional mechanisms, or both at the same time. What we do know is that the theme must remain at its core: strengthening conflict prevention, dialogue, and mediation is still necessary and urgent. And this is despite what we are seeing globally, where multilateralism is severely fractured. The AU has made remarkable strides in building African-owned peace and security mechanisms. We know that there are legal instruments and institutional mechanisms, as well as normative frameworks that are in place at the AU and the regional economic communities. Yet evolving threats demand continuous adaptation and strengthened partnerships, which through the Training for Peace program, as partners, we are providing on the basis of policy support, training and curriculum development, as well as research and knowledge product generation. If we look at the current mechanisms and achievements, we see the evolution of the African Union's own institutional architecture for peace and security, which is the cornerstone for conflict prevention, mediation, and dialogue on the continent. This includes the Continental Early Warning System, the Panel of the Wise, The network of African women mediators, commonly known as FemWise, as well as WISE Youth in terms of the Youth Network for Mediation Support. The mediation support itself within the Conflict Management Directorate of the African Union, the Peace and Security Council, the African Standby Force, and the Peace Fund. As Andrew has shared in the introduction, as partners, our program of work has remained strategically aligned to the objectives of the African Union, particularly on peace and security as well as peace building, where we have provided technical training, capacity building, and policy support. We continue to provide research, scenario building, and policy briefs that have been contributing into the AU system for early warning analysis, ensuring also that there is a level of evidence-based information that is being made available to the AU through the work that we do in our knowledge products. For mediation training, technical support, we have been providing support to the panel of the WISE as well as FemWise in terms of having to expand their skills in preventive diplomacy as well as inclusive dialogue. So this has resulted in capacity building components on conflict management, particular aspects in terms of peace support operations as well, and having to look at the role of WISE Youth now aligned to the Continental Youth Framework on Peace and Security, as well as UN Resolution 2250 on Youth, Peace and Security. As partners, we have had a long-standing arrangement, and the footprint of the Training for Peace program has been seen across the African peace and security architecture. My colleagues will speak to policy and dialogue forums, technical working groups that we have joined, capacity building initiatives, which has seen how APSA evolves with emerging challenges. We've also seen the links with the African governance architecture, and I think recognizing that peace and security is but one component, but the connect at the level of governance, democracy, and human rights remain instrumental to peace and stability. If we had to take away some insights from the work that we do, we have come to realize that prevention still needs to be prioritized. I know in this kind of environment, we start to wonder where, preventing what from whom when we see so much of what is happening is in terms of military might and military force. So the question would be why? Because there's a need to have a shift from a paradigm of strength moving to peace through dialogue. And for many in the room and for Norway as a country, the peace through dialogue component has been a cornerstone of your own foreign policy as well. We know from the period 1990 to around 2000, peace through dialogue was based on a values-driven approach, a transformational process as well as the evolution of a rules-based order. And within this construct, we see the African Union developing a range of mechanisms that I have mentioned, particularly on the African peace and security architecture side, that was meant to coordinate and manage and deal with conflict. So the currency at this time is moral authority, the gravitas of a panel of elders, the gravitas of core leaders on the continent, and a level of institutional legitimacy. But right now, that currency of peace through dialogue is being challenged at the level of peace through strength, peace through force, all of which we are seeing and all of which we are too familiar with, which is interest-driven, transactional diplomacy for peace and security in Africa, the something for something approach, the return to great power world orders, and the emergence of middle power world order. Military might, economic might, and artificial intelligence mastery is what seems to be leading this paradigm. It's not entirely incorrect to be able to say that it's not offering any solutions in terms of peace through strength. But the reality is that if we look at the context of the DRC and Rwanda deal, on the context of the US arrangement, we know that the diplomatic work is beyond just the possibility, as is any peace agreement on the continent. And the biggest burden will continue to fall with the African Union as the continental body and the regional economic communities. But what peace through strength misses is that these conflicts are deeply rooted, which require trust and confidence building, not just amongst conflicting parties, but the whole of society. And we speak of that social contract and the level of social cohesion which needs to be built and made strong in the context of our mediation work as well. It would be easy to criticize the African Union and the REX in terms of its peace frameworks that are set up and the level of effectiveness that it has maintained over the years. But the paradigm is not the only multilateral situation facing crisis today. It must therefore push for peace through dialogue. Even when a conflict ends, the reality is that poverty, unemployment, and inequality will persist. And therefore, the conversations around the on the drivers of conflict have to continue. And we see the full value of the African governance architecture as well as the African peace and security architecture as complementing each other. Practical steps will look at paying attention to resources after crises escalate, and sometimes the attention comes too late. Having to strengthen early warning systems and ensuring that early responses are politically backed and there's adequate resources made available. For mediation, we know that there are multiple actors these days, and I've mentioned in terms of middle power actors, existing actors, and that interest-based driven component means that some of the approaches will be fragmented, some of them will be transnational. How do we start to coordinate these? So mediation efforts will need to move beyond elite bargainings and looking at ways in which it can be inclusive, from the inclusion of women, youth, civil society, broadly in terms of affected communities as well. And through the Training for Peace program, our elements of focus in terms of the FemWise working with women, peace and security, the coordination through the Office of the Special Envoy on Women, Peace and Security, as well as WISE Youth, the African Union Youth Ambassadors for Peace across the 5 regions on the continent, are spaces in which we can provide practical examples for how we've been able to contribute to the mechanisms for mediating and managing conflict. The program is currently providing support through the AU in Mediation and Dialogue Division, and currently we are in the process of a review of a mediation support handbook, which has been a long-serving practical reference and field guide for African Union mediators and mediation teams. It gives a framework for mechanisms, tasks, and tools that are required for effective conflict resolution. The current revision is especially important as it seeks not only to integrate inclusivity, being gender sensitive, looking at including child protection issues, as well as youth issues, but the focus is looking at today's rapidly evolving mediation landscape. By mainstreaming some of these elements, the AU is not only updating its own strategies to reflect emerging conflict trends across the continent, but it reinforces the principle of African-led solutions and African-led mediation that must be legitimate, inclusive, and context-driven. Political dialogue will remain central. Our works with the African Union, the REX, and its mediation networks has shown that ensuring legitimacy and maintaining continuity in the dialogue processes are decisive for durable outcomes. So partners like ourselves on our programs act as knowledge partners. We're able to bridge policy and practice gaps through applied research. We've provided capacity development for the institutions, as well as promoting inclusive approaches through our work with women organizations within countries of conflict, youth organizations as well as entities that exist within the African peace and security architecture space. Now, I paint this picture like all's running smoothly and all's rolling well, but the reality is that there are gaps and there are still challenges. We know that often early warning won't translate into early action, or it takes time to translate into action as well. Mediation teams will lack adequate resources, technical expertise, coordinating and managing in a space where costs are being cut. Political dialogue processes will be undermined, as we see in the current context, through external influence, fragmented coordination between the REX and the AU, as well as a limited political will from member states itself. But this is also having emerging threats to deal with: cyber manipulation, climate shocks, like I've mentioned, transnational organized crime, which is currently stretching the existing tools that we have. But what is encouraging is the review currently of the African Union's governance, peace, and security frameworks, recognizing the need right now to critically examine and recalibrate its own peace and security governance. So if we look to strengthen conflict prevention and resolution, we know that aspects for institutional capacity will continue. The need for political will and member state engagement will still be required to ensure stronger compliance of the AU norms, and inclusivity that is anchored in a local context. But what will be critical going forward is innovation and adaptation. And what we see from the inclusion, in particular from young people in the space, is that they are contributors to transformational leadership and transformational processes. So we can look at ways in which we can integrate climate and environmental risks into continental early warning, look at ways in expanding digital democracy. There was some of that during the COVID period, but we also know how mediation works in terms of the one-on-one basis and the engagement. Looking at ways in which we can deal with cyber-driven disinformation and one that creates polarizing context, as well as continuing evidence-based decision-making through research and knowledge, which we do. Partnerships and continued partnership support, I think that's an ongoing discussion in terms of all spaces beyond the African Union, looking at ways in which they can be predictable and flexible funding for mediation and prevention in the current climate where the purse string is getting smaller and smaller as well. So in closing, just to say that we know that the mechanisms that are present at the African Union through APSA and through AGA are robust, but the reality is that the threats that are evolving faster than the tools that are readily available. So in having to continue investment in capacity, looking at ways in which we can be innovative, the AU still has to remain the primary guarantor of peace on the continent. We'd like to see collective commitment by member states, RECs, as well as partners, and it is the only way in which we can look to prevent some of the crises before they erupt. So peace through dialogue, but perhaps looking at it through the lens of peace through force. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, colleagues, and also Karishma for setting the scene. So my presentation actually focuses on 4 key lessons derived from addressing peace and security in Africa. So in their entirety, these lessons underscore the challenge in managing from the conflict landscape, and secondly, the urgent need to reform, adapt the global regional peace and security frameworks to effectively address and combat insecurity on the continent. So the first lesson, if I have to use one term, the term that I would be using would be disequilibrium. That is to refer to the growing mismatch between the challenge and the response capabilities. So this is one of our key lessons. What does it mean? So as we speak, currently there is a global decline in terms of peacefulness. We've been making this point also in the morning. Almost nearly every year since 2014. And Africa is at the center of this trend, meaning Africa remains the most conflict-afflicted region. Year to year, about 28 state-based conflicts are happening on the continent. And this is nearly double the count from 10 years ago. As a result, the AU Peace and Security Council, which is a standing decision-making organ on the continent, currently monitors approximately 20 to 23 conflicts every year, or country situations every year. That is huge. So the PSC, the Peace and Security Council, is an equivalent of the United Nations Security Council. So the Council always has about 20 to 23 conflicts under its purview. So if you put it into a percentage, that would be about 40% of the situations are in need of some sort of policy consideration by the Peace and Security Council. So this gives you an impression in terms of the kind of challenge that the continent is facing from a policy-making point of view. So there are protracted civil wars on the continent, such as Sudan, South Sudan, Somalia, DRC, transnational insurgencies arising from Islamic State, Al-Shabaab, and other groups, similar groups. also there are communal violence and electoral and political violences. So these are the kind of things that keep the continent busy. And this assessment is supported by think tanks and consortium like ours, which we do on a daily basis. We do continuous follow-up of what's happening on the continent. But it is also increasingly being recognized by the African Union itself. And this has a very clear policy implication in the sense that the growing conflict trends are literally outstripping the response capabilities, political resolve and resource of African member states and the African Union and the regional economic community. So this is lesson number one. So there is a mismatch between the conflict landscape and the capability of the AU, the REX, and their member states in terms of addressing this challenge. The second factor, the second lesson is how the factors constraining African collective responses have become increasingly evident. They have become almost common known. And partly due to the work of think tanks and consortium like ours, like the Training for Peace program. Meaning most of these conflicts are happening under a real-time scrutiny of think tanks and all of that. And what are some of these key factors? I would like to highlight about 4 of them. First of all, these collective responses, whether it is by the AU, by the regional economic communities, or by the UN itself for that matter, they have been undermined by the divergent understanding and interpretation of some key peace and security norms and principles, such as, for example, the principle of subsidiarity, the one that is binding the relationship between the AU and the regional economic communities. This is no more given. There is no shared understanding about what this principle stands for. There seems to be a different understanding of what it means. Also, the same about what is the role of sovereignty when it comes to you. So you, like member states, would sign in to a collective response mechanism, but at the same time, they also are very jealous and protective of their sovereignty. So how do you strike this balance? And this is constraining a number of responses on the continent. And of course, the most evident one is also capacity and resource constraints. This is a problem that cuts across many of the response efforts of the African Union in the regional economic communities, but it is more evident when it comes to peace support operation or when it comes to launching peacekeeping, which is a very resource-intensive endeavor. And finally, another key factor is the limited adaptability of peace and security frameworks. Meaning, we have what we call the Africa Peace and Security Architecture, a suite or a collection of norms, principles in the institution that has been established in the early 2000s. But these frameworks are quick, they are slow to adopt themselves to the current conflict landscape. So there is a limited adaptability of peace and security frameworks, but they used to make sense, perfect sense, for the time that they were established in the early 2000s. But the conflict landscape has significantly shifted. So there is a need to adapt these frameworks. And the third lesson is the growing realization of the need for adaptations. So we have outlined the challenge that's emanating, arising from the conflict landscape, but also the slow adaptation of these frameworks. And this has increasingly become evident. So that's why this discussion, the mismatch between the conflict landscape and the response capability, has led to increasing the policy discussion at the African Union level. For example, there is an outstanding Peace and Security Council decision in terms of revitalizing the AU continental early warning system. So it's called QUES. So there is now an ongoing discussion in terms of revitalizing the continental early warning system. And the same also about revitalizing or reviewing the Africa Standby Force, which was established almost two decades ago, which is increasingly in need of adaptation. And the same also preventive diplomacy, which my colleague Karishma has alluded earlier. So one of the key themes in various policy dialogues and discussion is that preventive diplomacy in Africa needs to be revitalized. So it should make sense to the current conflict landscape. And finally, also, what does peace building mean in the current context? So there is also a need in terms of adapting the EU's approach to peace building and all of that. And this has led to a discussion about the review of the EU post-conflict reconstruction and development. So the fourth lesson is what is the role of TFP or the consortium here with the support of Norway in terms of supporting these adaptation efforts. So as we were making a point in a similar policy dialogue in the morning, we have come to a stage in the life of the Training for Peace where the current focus is supporting adaptation efforts. Previously, it was supporting the AU in terms of building its capacity, building its norms and all of that. But now we've reached to a point that, first of all, these frameworks need to be put into use, meaning implementation. And second, and most importantly, these frameworks need to be adopted. So that's why our knowledge products are increasingly put into use in terms of a close scrutiny of the evolving landscape and the challenges emanating from that. So our added value is in terms of informed advocacy for adaptation efforts. So we synthesize the views from the African Union Commission, the think tanks, but also the civil society to come up what should be adaptation efforts should look like in the current context. And also informing policy processes. I think most of you are aware about the discussion about financing of AU peace support operation through UN Resolution 2017-90. So creating some knowledge products around this debate. First of all, what does it mean having not sufficient funds, for example, to fund the AU mission in Somalia? What does it mean? What is the operational constraints and implications of not having funds? Whether you're going to stay there for 6 months or whether you are going to stay for one year or 4 years. That's all depending. You cannot really plan properly in terms of having your operations on the ground if you don't have the resources for it. So we kind of produce knowledge around that, what it means in the specific context, but also informing the policy processes as well. Also, in terms of connecting global policy discussions, such as the ongoing discussion about the review of UN operations, with also the imperative of adapting the EU's approach to peace support operation. So our knowledge products are trying to get a connection between these global and regional discussions. And finally, we also leverage knowledge for capacity building. For example, we are working with the African Union in terms of standardizing and harmonizing their policy deployment for African peace support operations, or in terms of creating the capacity for young people in terms of how to engage in peace processes. So the TFP partners work in terms of contributing to the AU process around that. So in conclusion, these 4 lessons illustrate the disequilibrium or the mismatch in Africa's peace and security landscape, the constraining challenge, and the emerging consensus on adaptation, and the TFP's role in supporting reforms. So to tackle insecurity effectively, enhanced global regional collaboration must be enhanced, and the same also in terms of getting the right resources and ensuring adaptive, inclusive policy process. Let me stop there now. And
lastly, we have Linda online. Linda, if you can unmute.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Good afternoon to all of you, and thank you for coming to this afternoon's briefing. As the coordinator of the TFP program, I'd like to first of all thank the Norwegian taxpayers for your contribution to sustaining peace and security on the African continent. It's something that we do not take for granted, and we're grateful. I would like to focus on what I term the software of the TFP program. How the TFP continues to provide soft support to the African Union in its efforts to enhance governance, peace, and security on the continent. And in starting, I'd like you to imagine, first of all, a situation where there was no TFP. It is very easy to look at what is happening around the continent and to get despondent. But then this is what is happening, even with all of the work that is being done, not just by TFP, but many other partners and many other governments. And so let us for a split second imagine what the situation could have been like without these kinds of support. And so I would like to point out three main things when it comes to the TFP that I think are our strengths in supporting the African Union. The first is that the TFP acts as a bridge builder. 30 years of support has earned it the space of trust within the African Union Commission, but also among the regional economic communities and some member states. And so TFP provides bridge building, whether it is between the African Union and the United Nations or with the African Union and some of its regional economic communities. The second is that it supports innovations, and I think my colleagues have already spoken a lot about that. But because it is made up of three partners who invest in research and knowledge generation, we are able to identify critical areas, what I would call levers, that are important for the work of the African Union Commission and bring that to the attention of the African Union. And we also have the space to influence policy, and I would speak about all of these very shortly. So given all of the challenges that you have been told about and which you already knew, I believe, before you came in for this briefing, why do we continue with the TFP program? The first is the fact that it is critical that the AU continues to adapt. And how do we support the AU's adaptation? I'll give one example. The African Union mission in Somalia, AMISOM, has gone through 3 iterations now. So we had AMISOM, which transitioned to ATMIS, the African Union Transition Mission in Somalia, which has now transitioned to ALSOM, the African Union Stabilization Support Mission to Somalia. And in all of these 3, the context changed. So what we do, for example, is ensure that our training manuals or the AU's training manuals, which we help them to develop, are constantly reviewed to adapt to these contextual realities. Otherwise, we have police who are getting deployed from all over Africa into Somalia. They deploy without necessarily knowing what the context today is. And we cannot continue to do things in ALSOM as we used to do in AMISOM 7 years ago, 8 years ago. So our constant tweaking, reviewing, and bringing to bear changes in the field to our training enables those who work in the field to be able to adapt their strategies and their tactics to be able to adequately respond to the needs of the countries in which they serve. The African Union and the REX-RMs continue to face institutional capacity challenges, and this is no secret. The African Union has a high iteration rate. Unfortunately, a lot of people continue to work in and to leave. And part of what the TFP has been able to do, we've done 2 things in this regard. We provide backstopping, essentially, but we also ensure that through the technical expertise that we provide, we help the African Union to sustain its institutional memory and ensure that new people who come are able to hit the ground running, as it were. We don't just do this for the Commission, we do this also for the REX and the RMs. And a good example, for instance, is with the African Capacity Roster, which one of our partners supports. We tend to get a very high iteration rate every 3-4 years. officers are changed because these are seconded officers from member states. And it becomes imperative to ensure that those who get on board receive the training that they need to be able to carry the work forward. One of the areas really supported the Union with is in the area of inclusive peace building. It's not always been easy, but we've been trying to ensure that women, youth, and in recent times, persons with disabilities are intentionally considered in the African Union's work. A few years ago, we helped the African Union to develop its very first continental youth peace and security framework and an implementation framework to go with it. And this is what has informed, if you have heard of, the national action plans for youth and peace and security in many member states. So we provide strategic support to the Commission, and this strategic support is then taken on by the regional economic communities and cascades down to member states. Another area where we have provided support and where our support remains critical is convening the African Union and the United Nations to bring mainly the technical or the bureaucrats together to dialogue. Oftentimes where there are challenges actually relates to the strategic and political actors. But amongst the technocrats and the bureaucrats, there is a way of finding workable solutions even to challenging problems. And in this area, through knowledge product, but also the convening power of the TFP, we've managed to be able to bring the two entities together. Sometimes when we're lucky, we're able to bring them and the works together to dialogue and to try to find workable options to what the strategic political leaders are unable to unlock through politics and diplomacy. Finally, I think that because we have stayed, because we have been consistent, we have been able to influence in very subtle ways some of the work of the African Union through lessons learned. Now, for instance, as my colleagues have mentioned, there is a strategic review of the African Standby Force. We need to ensure that the African Standby Force becomes fit for purpose. At the political level, there are many things that will have to be unlocked. At our level as TFP, our level of influence is limited. And so through this review, through our research, the knowledge generation that we have had, we've been able to provide technical support in shaping and framing what we believe needs to change and how these changes ought to happen. And we hope that as we continue to push, strategic decision makers will take these things up and be able to make the changes that are required. I think I will end here, and if there are any questions, I'll be happy to help to answer them. Thank you very much.
So, just before we go to some question and answers, I have one if I can, and it's mostly for all three of you. But I think one of the things that I'm mindful of is, given the somewhat decline of multilateralism across the globe, not just across the continent, but globally, we see the sort of unraveling of institutions, undermining of institutions. How can an institution like the AU navigate through some of these challenges at this time? Who'd like to start? Should we go in reverse order? Yeah.
Okay. So Andrew, thank you. That's a challenging question, but a question that needs to be answered. I think that the AU's agency is very limited when it comes to the global order that we are confronted with today. And that is why having networks like the Friends of the African Union, which Norway is part of, is very, very important. I'll give you a few examples. Without the African Union has the tools, the institutional tools, it has the policies, it has the frameworks to be able to respond to the crisis on the continent. The challenge is that there are a number of actors involved in the crisis on the continent. In the past, we didn't have as many actors. Today we do. And whilst a number of these actors have a lot to gain, they have very little to lose because of their own lack of governance structures and the unshared value systems. And so the being able to address the challenges require the United Nations to step in. I believe that when the United Nations felt that there was a need and stepped in, between them and the African Union, they were able to make some changes in Darfur. Unfortunately, we see what is happening in Sudan, which has reversed all of the gains that were made almost. But let's go to Somalia. And without the two entities working together, we wouldn't be where we are today. If we go to Mali, again, it's an unfortunate situation how things are being rolled back. But if you look at how the African Union, the United Nations, and France bilaterally worked together to get Mali to a point before the junta happened, we need the United Nations to step in to activate the agent of the African Union. Without that, the African Union is severely constrained. And this is not just about financing. Financing plays a big part of it, but it's also about ensuring that we get the politics right. Because if you look at how the African Standby Force was configured, initially, the idea was that when an entity, a region was unable to respond to its own crisis, another region would be able to step in. But as I mentioned this morning, something that we haven't factored in is the fact that when the African Standby Force concept was being evolved, a number of African countries were still not under democracies. So we use the example of ECOWAS in Liberia and Sierra Leone. We use the example of Uganda and countries in the East African region being able to address some of the challenges that have been caused by the LRA. But now, a number of the countries on the continent are democracies or quasi-democracies. And because of that, there are legislative constraints on what the executive is able to do. So, for example, when ECOWAS decided to go to Niger, for example, the member states had to go back to their legislative bodies. And the legislative bodies, after deliberating, a number of them said we would prefer a diplomatic solution rather than a military solution to this problem. We need to have this at the back of our minds. And so when we have the Security Council stepping in as the premier entity for the maintenance of global peace and security, and through the Security Council mandating the African Union to act on its behalf, perhaps we will be able to get much more traction than assuming that one regional body would be able to step in when the region that is affected is unable to. And we've seen it happen, the challenges that we've been confronted with, whether it is in the DRC or in some of the other countries that we are witnessing. So essentially, in answering your question, activating the agency of the African Union is very much linked to getting the politics right at the United Nations. And that is a big challenge because of the retreat of multilateralism. Thank you.
Yeah. So, like Linda said, it's a very tough question, but I think we have to confront this question and try to respond to it. I think first we all need to start by recognizing that this declining multilateralism is a threat not just to African regional actors, but also to international and bigger actors such as the United Nations itself. So that's why the UN has embarked on a process such as the Pact for the Future, the new agenda for peace. These are all processes for making the case for multilateralism. So trying to bring to bear what are the key outstanding challenges and trying to find solution around that. As you may recall, like in May this year, there was the UN Berlin Peacekeeping Ministerial, that was, for example, making the case for the continued presence of peacekeeping, while at the same time also making the case that it needs to be adopted. So in the same vein, one way of navigating the African Union in terms of navigating the current challenge in terms of multilateralism is to have a collective voice in some of the ongoing discussions, whether it is in the Pact for the Future or in the peacekeeping ministerial debate and all of that. There needs to be some sort of a collective voice around that. And the same also about processes such as the review of the peace-building architecture and all of that. So that is, there needs to be a collective voice that needs to be articulated in this kind of discussion. Another critical consideration is in terms of demonstrating leadership in some of country-level situations and crises. That is one way for the AU navigating this complex political environment. And it goes without saying that, yes, multilateralism is declining, but at the same time, there is also a large coalition which is for multilateralism at the same time. So usually what we hear is that there is a retreat from multilateralism, but at the same time, there is also a large coalition of countries and groups and regional actors which are making the case, which believe in multilateralism. And that is what, for example, the Berlin Peacekeeping Ministerial has shown. More than 70 countries came together and they made pledges in terms of supporting the UN peacekeeping while adopting it. So this is not a one-sided story. Yes, multilateralism is also declining, but there is also a large coalition. So the AU needs to join that group of actors who are supporting multilateralism.
Commissioner, please.
Thanks, Andrew. Recognizing the retreat of multilateralism, and I think the very essence of that is the basis of institutions. And I think what we can see in this current context, and which has always been, I think, the core of the way in which African conflicts have been managed to a degree, and that is looking at the role of civil society and civil society actors that are within the national context, recognizing that the impact is felt most there. I think when we come to the elements of multilateralism, it is at the point of having to define where and how we want to prevent and where and how we want to make a point of resolution, without realizing and recognizing that it is those very groups on the ground at a civil society level, at a community level, that are already starting to deal with the realities of the conflict as well. So when we talk about a collective voice, that collective voice has to not only focus on your, your core political actors, but it is your core stakeholders who are impacted by the conflict itself. And if we look at it in the context of national action plans for women, peace and security, national action plans for youth, peace and security, which have escalated as well in the context of regional action plans for the role of women, for the role of young people in peace and security as well, looking at ways in which they can impact peace processes in their own countries. So there are levels of solutions, levels of peacemaking and peace building within these very communities that are impacted by what is happening in the country itself. So if we look at a Sudan, for example, or a South Sudan, whilst the decision makers, it doesn't seem like there's an end in sight in terms of a Sudan, the reality is that outside of that context, you have your women's networks, you have your youth networks that are coordinating with the African Union, that are coordinating with like-minded think tanks like ourselves, as well as the regional economic communities, to be able to find ways in which they can influence the process as it is ongoing at a track one level in terms of higher political.
Colleagues, I'm going to open the floor up for questions from the floor. So please, if you don't mind, I see a hand already, but introduce yourself when you are selected, and just go straight in with the question. Please, the lady.
Thank you. Becky here. Thank you for the insightful discussion. The question I want to raise is on sustainability, global green energy shift, which often relies on natural minerals and raw materials for the infrastructure. So So the question is, if renewable energy relies on extracting minerals, that cause displacement, poverty, and environmental destruction, sometimes even fueling conflict, both short and long term, how can we call this global green energy sustainable? Or what is the cost of innovation? So I want to understand how we can say that we're sustainable when it comes to innovation or green energy. We say, oh, we have a green energy, we're sustainable, but how can we be that when we don't support the 3 pillars of sustainability, that is social, economic, and environmental? Thank you.
Any more questions?
No, that's it.
Sorry. Thank you so much for the very insightful conversation, marking the 30 years for TFP. It will also be very interesting to hear how you think about the next 30 years for TFP, and how the program should adapt, and what kind of potential do you see here and now for development.
Who would like to take the question on sustainability of resource and destruction?
I'll try, because it's not, I think in terms of sustainability, I think there's full recognition in terms of the resources and that are available on the African continent. And in terms of renewable energy sources, if we go back to the element of national interest, the national interest is not in the purview of the member state that is in conflict. It is that of the outside or external actor. And the reality is that, yes, there should be this alliance in terms of the social, economic, and environmental aspect, but it's not happening, because in terms of where our countries, particularly, for example, like the DRC finds itself, in terms of resources, it is who's able to offer it better supplies in terms of weapons, better supplies in terms of having to manage what is happening in the east of the country as well. So the level of resources becomes negligible in the bigger conversation as well. So, yeah.
All right.
Let me take a stab at the second question. The first one, given our focus, we may not be able to fully address the second question fully, the first question fully. But in terms of the question around the next 30 years of the TFP, our wish and our aspiration is that there will not be another 30 years of training for peace. Or if at all, what we wanted to see is there is a durable peace established on the continent, and that the continent would start focusing on other issues such as sustainable energy transition and all of that. But as we speak, the focus of the African Union is very much lopsided in terms of addressing peace and security, in terms of budget, in terms of staffing, in terms of resources. By all matrices, the focus is now on peace and security. So our hope is that this balance is established and the AU is working on other issues. But we can already start thinking of, let's say, the coming 5-10 years, meaning establishment of, for example, preventive diplomacy, which we would wish that preventive action and preventive diplomacy is at center stage. We would also wish that governance and conflict prevention frameworks are consolidated. This is what we wanted to see, at least in the coming 5 to 10 years. We would like to see more inclusive peace-building processes, meaning more youth and women are in the decision-making tables. So this is what we wanted to see, at least in the interim, in terms of being the focus of the Training for Peace projects.
Can I, just add to Dawood's point in terms of the next 30 years as well. Fully agree that we would like to see ourselves out of the process in terms of a next cycle of the program, especially for 30 years. I think if we look at the markers in terms of the AU's Agenda 2063, we want to be able to achieve the aspirations of that in terms of the value it brings for all people on the continent. But if we also look at it from the perspective of where the funding mechanism, the funding conversation is going, the shift in terms of trade, not aid, and I think we would like to see the peace and security component shift to a development trajectory in terms of having to deal with the very drivers of conflict in terms of poverty, unemployment, inequality. Because if we're talking about building a social contract between citizen and state, it needs to be able to provide these kinds of services. So that development component in terms of having states provide levels of governance to make itself sustainable going forward, to be able to provide young people with jobs. I mean, we see the context in Kenya in terms of unrest in relation to high levels of unemployment, high costs of living. So the element is we hear one thing about we want to trade with you, but then, I mean, come full circle to your point around we'll trade with you, but the trade-off for us is, access to resources, access to your renewable energy, for things that we have not ourselves created in terms of the continent, but things that we find ourselves constantly paying for. So I think that development trade would be a good next transition point for us.
Linda, any comments from you?
When we talk about African solution to African problems, I think that it's important also to recognize the limits of that and to appreciate the fact that all these things that my colleagues have spoken about can happen only if we continue to perceive Africa's challenges as being linked to global challenges. And so on the issue of transitioning to green energy, one of the ways that African countries and the African Union is now actually developing a common African position on climate, peace and security, which, at the outset acknowledges the fact that its resources will be exploited for its people, but it will be exploited in a sustainable manner. And here, the point to be noted is the issue of governance. We need to ensure that there is good natural resource governance in all its aspects to be able to have that green transitioning in a manner that does not leave us with conflicts and with challenges as we saw with other natural resources on the continent, like diamonds, like gold, etc. In terms of, TFP and transitioning from peace and security firefighting to a more developmental phase, there is a need to recognize and to continue to push for a new global order. We are at a crossroads now. As I said, there are a number of actors who have a lot to gain from the chaos than to lose. And these actors have become spoilers. Unfortunately, we cannot also run away from our own leadership challenges in member states. And so because of the leadership challenges that we are confronted with, it works because leaders are happy not to continue to adhere to the shared values of the African Union. And unlike in the past, when they would have been constrained in the present, there are options, let me put it this way. And so how then do we rein that back in? We can only do that if there is a new global order from which the African Union's values can be reinforced. Until that is done, I'm afraid that we will continue to do what we can, but it will not be adequate. Back to you, Andrew.
And probably just few responses from my end on your question. I think one aspect that the continent needs to drive to is a mindset of the worth. What is the worth that we have as a continent for the resources and minerals that are there? And what is that tag? What is it worth? And I think the continent needs that mind shift because as you said, unfortunately, what we have is people come in, they offer a certain amount, and we devalue what the actual continent is worth. So I think that's the first point for me. And then we need radical thinking. And when I mean radical thinking, it's not just about saying, okay, let's take the resources and, you know, we build a factory, it goes exported to a factory somewhere in the West. Actually, what can we be doing for the young people, as I said, in Kenya, who might need jobs, who might be the next future leaders or the business people that that can move that industry forward. And so I think we need to rethink that aspect as well. And I think the third aspect is really about not just knowledge exchanging. Norway has immense resources and be able to learn. We can learn from that, but it's also about how we can build the capacity of the continent and learn from Norway, but do it in the right way as well. And I think Norway has a prime example around how it's managed its own resources as well. So again, lessons there that can be learnt through other mechanisms like the Nordic African Ministers meeting, where there's an exchange. But there's other mechanisms that I think, again, the continent can learn from these examples. But again, it requires leadership to do that as well. Let me go ahead and I'll come back. Yes.
Andrew,
Yes.
I have my hand up.
Okay.
Just as a follow-up to that, I think that we do get a lot of the bad news, but I just wanted to share some positive news. So as you are aware, when Ghana found oil, one of the things that it tried to do was to learn from Norway's example. And so it set up something akin to a futures fund. And then when we went into a crisis, one of the first areas that government wanted to draw money from was actually from that futures fund. But because, and this goes back to governance, because of the lessons that we had learned, the way that it had been set up was such that government could not just go and dip its hand in the fund, as you know, at will. It had to go through the processes that had been put in place. And the people who managed the fund said, no, you can look for money elsewhere, cut your defense spending, etc., but you will not touch the futures fund. I think that we don't have a lot of, documented lessons, positive lessons like these ones, but they also exist. And so that knowledge exchange, capacity building is something that may not be hardcore, but it's something that is worth continuing to do. I just thought I would add that to your point. Thanks.
So the lady here.
Thank you for the discussion. My name is Sunniva. I work with Caritas Norway. I wanted to go back to the 2250 resolution because maybe especially in the light of now South Sudan, for example, which has deteriorated quite rapidly. And I was wondering if you have any insights on the barriers, because such a huge young population who could be very important peace agents, but which room or which agency do they have in such a situation, and what are the barriers that have to be challenged for that resolution to really blossom? Thank you.
I saw a hand here, and I think there was two hands here. This one? Okay.
I'm going to ask again a question, but Dawit Jonas talked about a global policy, and it was adapting the AU and UN. So I have a question when it comes to, for example, how can AU or UN, let's say AU, do ESG reports on renewable energy infrastructures, and how can we trace the raw materials, for example, like coffee or any infrastructures that we build? Like we need batteries, we need anything that we see innovation, from the simplest thing to the biggest thing. It needs raw materials and need minerals, and we have to ask this critical question. And I need to, not need to understand, but I want to understand, how can we do ESG report, like you said, governance, environmental, social governance. So how can we we take, for example, the sustainable pillars, we take social, we forget that, and then we economic or environmental. So how can we actually do environmental, social governance together as it's meant to be? And when it comes to sustainable pillars, I was wondering, how can we do both social, environmental, and economic together? Not just one thing is good here, the other is good here, and not. That's my question. Thank you.
So we've got two questions. One on the barriers to youth, particularly in South Sudan or Sudan.
South Sudan. but
South Sudan.
any use fire.
And the second question on, I guess more of a, how do we take environmental social governance more as a collective whole, holistic approach to responding to some of the challenges the continent faces? Should we go in the original order?
1, 2, 3, 3, 2, 1. In the context of Resolution 2250, I spoke of the parallel in terms of the African Union's continental youth, peace and security framework. And the pillars are the same in terms of participation, prevention, protection, reintegration on that basis as well. But when we talk to the aspect of the barriers of participation, I don't, it's not a lack of wanting to participate, let's just put it that way. There is a large number of youth-led organizations and institutions like ourselves will get requests on the ISS side in terms of the work that we are doing with Wise Youth. We see the request that comes via the Wise Youth network itself from the particular countries as well. So the aspect in terms of managing participation is one, through building capacity. We found that having to provide skills, particularly to youth-based community organizations in the country, and even those outside in terms of being based in Uganda or in Kenya as well, to be able to provide conflict management skills to them, the ability to provide leadership skills. So in order to engage, you have the level and the skill set to enter the space or ask to be in that space. So that's the skills building and capacity component. The second component at the level of the African Union is recognizing, and I think we're seeing more and more visibility of the African Youth Ambassadors for Peace, and these are regional, as I shared. So in terms of the Eastern Horn of Africa, there is a particular envoy who is based in Uganda, but the connecting point is that the responsibility that she has is for a region. So I think the level of responsibility and accountability invested in young leaders themselves is becoming more visible. So they, at a country level, people know that they have access to them as well. The other point then is also at the regional economic community level, we have the Youth Envoy for IGAD. Now, this is also a new role for the Youth Envoy, and to be faced with daunting spaces like the DRC, like South Sudan, like Sudan as well, to be able to determine how to get young people into the space. It's one, having to be deliberately invited into the spaces, which institutions like ourselves, if opportunities presents themselves, we ask that they are included in it. If they have requests, for example, in terms of assisting with reflecting on, for example, the situation in the DRC and what youth can do. So it's actually giving them the space and the platform to be able to engage their own constituencies to facilitate dialogue and for them to make, to take those recommendations and inputs back either into a member state level with representatives that come, for example, from across the Great Lakes region, into IGAD in terms of the Eastern Horn of Africa region. And then finally, in terms of so I've mentioned the IAPS, the Youth Envoy, at the level of the Wise Youth as well, because that's the official space in terms of having to engage with the African Union more directly, particularly for mediation. And lastly, the ability to work with connecting these organizations not just at the African Union level, but also at the UN level through other CSO entities. And that's what Resolution 2250, in connecting with the AU Continental Framework is able to do as well. So national action plans at the national level, the regional, and then to global as well as a policy space. Thank you.
Garrett?
What should be the steps that need to be taken in terms of ensuring sustainability, also environmental governance and all of that?
Just speak loud.
All right. Okay. So, from where we sit, I think there are a couple of things that need to happen. First of all, getting peace and security on the continent right. Getting governance in its entirety right. So that helps to establish the right priority at the moment. But the unfortunate reality at the moment is after 25 years of building these peace and security frameworks, where there is some sort of a regress in terms of addressing peace and security on the continent. So that's why the whole issue of reforms and adaptation of the governance, peace and security is becoming again center stage. Otherwise, the knowledge, the norms, it already exists. The frameworks exist. I'm sure if you bring the right experts, they will tell you what the status of implementation and progress in terms of environmental security and governance. But perhaps one challenge that could be mentioned here is that the usual problem of adopting norms but failing to implement them at a national level. For example, when it comes to the African Union Peace and Security Agenda, African Union Commission leadership, they talk about 93% of the AU's decisions are not implemented by member states. After all, things get implemented by member states. So I would suspect the same challenge could also happen in terms of ensuring environmental governance right in terms of at a member state level. The norms are there. In fact, the African Union is actually leading the curve when it comes to developing and adopting the norms. But eventually, the challenge of implementing is what is lagging behind. And partly it is because of this persisting peace and security challenge on the continent that is taking us back to square one again.
Linda, any response from your end?
When it comes to the issue of young people and the various resolutions, it's not just the UN, the AU also has a whole policy on youth. I think that we need to look at it from a whole of country approach. It is something that young people are trying. They are getting more and more active in the political space. But then there are systemic and structural barriers to their ability to contribute effectively. And until we are able to unlock that, and that unfortunately will take a bit of time to do, we will not see the kind of prominent engagement that we may want to see. My thinking is that perhaps we may have to work at what I call the track 3 level, which is at the grassroots and community level, building capacity, building a core of young people who understand dialogue, who understand mediation, who understand coexistence. Because we need to also understand the country-specific context in which we are working with. When you work in a country where you have such divisions based on, different factors, it's important first and foremost to try and build a state, that is cohesive and where people see themselves as one rather than belonging to subgroups. And I think that working at the track 3 level, still using these frameworks, because when you think of South Sudan and you think of the Comprehensive Peace Agreement and, the promise it held, for example, for gender, and where we are at now. So yes, we get women who get into government, but to what end? And how are they pushing the women peace and security agenda rather than a regime or a political agenda? So I think that starting from track 3, building a core of young people who understand coexistence, giving them the tools for dialogue, for facilitation, this could be very, very useful. I recall that I think about 2 or 3 years ago, the African Union did something quite innovative. They called it the Democracy Innovation Challenge. And they tried to get young people from countries on the continent to come up with some innovation to address a governance challenge within their country. And they were given seed money, but in addition to that, they were also given training. We supported that. and provided them training so that they would be able to write proposals, so that they would be able to do things that help them to convene and build capacity on their own. Unfortunately, it ended up being a one-off thing, and there wasn't much follow-up. But engaging at track 3, I think, at this point, would be very, very important. Thank you.
And just to add, from my perspective, I also think there's a need for international organizations and embassies and governments to also engage at that level too as well. I think there is an over-focus on just the heads of states that comes with it and the dignitaries that follow the elites and whatnot. And I think what that does is it reinforces the same issues of governance and democracy that we talk about that end up in fallacies. And so I think there needs to be a rethink about, okay, who are the youth leaders in these countries? Who are the women leaders? How do we engage not just on small projects, but substantially with them? Because if these are the people that we're saying are going to move the continent forward, not just the African continent, but the globe, then we need to be engaging with these people and engaging them in a very fierce way, I would say, and not just piecemeal, small bits of crumbs here and there. So I think changing that on its head is crucial to doing that. But that requires a change of mindset and seeing that actually the value's in them and not just engaging with the elites. Any other questions before we come to the end?
Thank you, Andrew. My name is Komi. I'm the Senior Program Advisor based in Addis and following up the training for peace agreement. So my question is related to the new AU leadership that we are in office as of February. So now there are a range of pressing issues at their plate that they have to focus. And in my view, implementing flagship initiatives like silencing the gun is one of the priority. So my question to you is, have you seen any, change of their plan in terms of doing things differently from the previous leadership in order to meet this, the objective of this initiatives like the silencing the gun? Would be my question. Thank you.
And that will be the last question that we take. Darren, I'm going to throw it to you.
Yeah. A new leadership is always a new opportunity. Sometimes they come with a different perspective. So this might be what can be considered old problems, but then old problems will be looked at with fresh perspective. So that's how we see it, at least with the coming of the new leadership. At least we can go back also to the debate leading to the election. By new leadership, we are talking about the leadership of the African Union Commission. So there was a debate, a public debate. At least the current leadership, at least from our point of view, from a think tank perspective, was speaking to the critical challenge that we talk about. Issues related to Africa peace and security architectures and what needs to happen in more policy and concrete terms. This is at least my personal opinion and assessment during that debate. And the new leadership also seems to have done the right things in terms of, like, for example, going to the right hotspots, to the hotspots that's on the continent itself. So by this we are talking about making a visit to Somalia, making a visit to South Sudan. So this is also not just symbolic, but also it means a lot to those people working on the ground to have the leadership coming in speaking to them. So I think that is also an encouraging sign. But most importantly, it might not be directly the making of the current leadership, but the current leadership has been given a task or the commission has been given the task to review all peace and security frameworks, including the silencing the guns. So silencing the guns is one of the frameworks that is to be looked at in terms of what needs to be done going forward. So this we are talking about ongoing processes that's going to start probably the coming days and all the way to the coming 4 months. So these are some encouraging signs. Yeah, thank you.
I'll go to Linda, then I'll go to Kushma.
While change is important, continuity when it comes to peace and security is also very important. And I think that it is important that even if approaches are changed, the frameworks, the pivots on which the AU work continues uninterrupted. So with regards to silencing the guns, a few months ago, I think 2 months or maybe a month ago, there was a midterm review actually. And the midterm review was able to highlight some of the positive aspects, but also some areas where there may be a need for change. And one of the critical things that came up, for example, was the fact that hitherto silencing the guns has focused mainly on hotspot countries. And yet we know that peace and security, governance, peace and security falls on a continuum. And so it is important for engagement and for deliberate efforts to be made, even engage those member states that are not necessarily on the radar of the PSC as conflict affected or countries in conflict. And a few other things that also came up. And so I think that the new leadership has opportunity to re-angle some of the ways in which things are done, but it is also important for continuity that we maintain a certain consistency. But again, the new leadership is only a part of that puzzle. The ability to engage meaningfully, because they took over power and not too long ago, and what did we see? We saw countries signing agreements instead of signing agreements on the continent, signing agreement on another continent. These things undermine the African Union Commission, and it's important that these are also recognized and addressed. Thank you.
Thanks. I think what we need to recognize that when we talk about leadership, we're talking about individuals. And I think when we make a reflection on the basis of the African Union, it is an institution. So similar to what Linda is saying in terms of change will come with people, but the institutional mechanism and the framework that is established is something that has to be consistent. And I think the part of that aspect has been about knowledge management of what is happening inside of the AU to allow for that level of consistency and coordination, in broad strokes as well. And in the context of that leadership and being able to bring hope, and I think we always remain hopeful for this continent. If we didn't, I think the four of us, around this room here wouldn't be here in terms of making that commitment. So the collective action doesn't just come from the institution. It comes from institutions like ourselves, locally based institutions who have a vested interest on the outcomes of the continent, but also individuals like ourselves as well. And I think the one thing that we can look at is consistent and broader engagement and outreach with the regional economic communities, given that it sees integration, reintegration as one of its core principles as well. And I say this very loosely, the ability to speak with one voice, and I use one voice loosely because oftentimes on the global stage there's such disparate views in terms of the African voice. It doesn't have to be one common voice, because there'll be a variety of views, but at least with a voice that speaks to the benefit of the continent rather than the benefit of interests of a particular member state. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, the audience, for being here today, and please join me in thanking our speakers for taking the time to talk to us today and in a very informative discussion as well. Thank you.